Estonia is building a wall of war, and Russia is the reason. While the world watches Ukraine, Estonia is preparing for what could come next. Alongside Latvia and Lithuania, it's launching the Baltic Defense Line, a sweeping, multi-country project to turn their shared borders with Russia and Belarus into one giant military barricade. We're talking 600 concrete bunkers, fortified supply points, and layered defenses stretching across NATO's eastern edge. It's not a bluff, it's a signal. If Russia tries to roll west, it won't be easy or cheap. So what exactly is being built, and why is Estonia, of all countries, taking the lead? To answer that, we have to rewind the clock, way back before modern Estonia or Russia even existed. Between 1940 and the late 1980s, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania existed as union republics within the Soviet system. But unlike other Soviet territories that had been part of the Russian Empire for centuries, the Baltic states maintained distinct national identities, languages, and cultures that never fully assimilated into the Soviet framework. Sure, the Soviet efforts to repopulate the war-struck nations and remove national identities over unitary ones meant resettling Russians to the region and emigrating natives out, but the core Baltic culture remained vastly different from other European nations within the Union or even in the Warsaw Pact. Surprisingly, the Baltic states also had a constitutional right to secede from the USSR, which was mainly theoretical and perfunctory. However, as the Soviet Union's economy faltered during the late 1980s, increased calls for autonomy and outright independence led to the three states becoming the first Soviet territories to exercise it. What set the breakaway Baltics apart from the other former Soviet republics was their nearly immediate turn to the west shortly after regaining independence, rather than trying to patch their relationship with the Russian Federation. All three countries successfully pursued similar programs of political and economic reform, remaking themselves as democracies with booming market potential. With European integration and revitalization of their cultures, they joined both NATO and the European Union in 2004. However, NATO membership wasn't just about economics or prestige. For the small Baltic states that were perilously close to Russia's largest population centers and navy ports on the Baltic Sea, it was about survival. What might surprise you is just how little Vladimir Putin, who was already president when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined NATO in 2004, initially cared about their pro-Western shift. His reaction at the time was remarkably muted by today's standards. In 2001, during a radio interview with National Republic Radio, when asked if he opposed the admission of the three Baltic nations into NATO, Putin responded that the issue could not be summed up in a yes or a no. He later added that we cannot forbid people to make certain choices if they want to increase the security of their nations in a particular way. This wasn't because Putin was suddenly a fan of the West. Rather, Russia in the early 2000s was still recovering from the economic collapse of the 1990s, and Putin was focused on consolidating power domestically rather than projecting it. He maintained the facade of working alongside NATO, going so far as to claim that Russia could even become a member if given enough time. But something fundamental shifted in the world and Putin's thinking around 2003. The next round of democratic expansion in the post-Soviet world, the 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia, escalated US-Russian tensions significantly. Putin blamed the United States directly for assisting this democratic breakthrough and helping install someone whom he saw as a pro-American puppet, President Mikhail Saakashvili. This would outline a pattern that actually started from past NATO actions in Yugoslavia in 1999 and would be repeated throughout the 21st century. Putin wasn't primarily threatened by NATO's military capabilities, as NATO is a defensive alliance. It has never attacked the Soviet Union or Russia, and it likely never will. Putin knows that. The real threat came from NATO's determination to support democracies and undermine oppressive governments, at least as seen through NATO's lens, often by using the alliance's position as the largest and best-funded military power. This goes double for a major post-Soviet country like Ukraine, which was the second largest and militarily prominent breakaway nation from the Union, with the closest demographics and culture to Russia. Putin can't have a successful and democratic Ukraine on Russia's border that doesn't have ties to Russia. This is where Estonia and the other Baltic states became a problem for Putin that extended far beyond military strategy. The Baltics were proof that former Soviet peoples could thrive without Russian control, a sentiment that obviously echoed in Ukraine. For the first decade of Baltic NATO membership, the defensive concerns remained largely theoretical. Yes, there were occasional tensions and military exercises, but the prospect of actual conflict seemed remote. Then 2014 changed everything. Russia's annexation of Crimea in February 2014 following protests for closer ties with the West and the removal of Ukraine's pro-Russia president from office, raised concern among NATO members about the potential for similar Russian actions in the Baltics. The implication for the Baltic states were terrifying and immediate. Baltic leaders took the lessons of the Crimea conflict to heart. They concluded that they needed to be able to respond quickly to the first signs of similar pressure from Russia against their own countries. But the real shock came in 2016 after NATO conducted war games to test its ability to defend the Baltic states. The results were sobering beyond anyone's worst fears. War games from 2014 and 15 found that Russian troops could enter the Estonian capital of Tallinn and the Latvian capital of Riga within 60 hours, practically blitzkrieging through the Baltic and preventing any kind of unified NATO response before it was too late. Think about that for a moment. NATO's own simulations suggested that two national capitals of alliance members could fall in less than 3 days. The implications were staggering. Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which commits all members to defend any attacked ally, would be meaningless if those allies were overrun before help could arrive. This vulnerability was now compounded by a geographic nightmare that military strategists call the Suwalki Gap. The narrow 40 to 60-mile corridor along the Polish-Lithuanian border has emerged as one of the most strategically vulnerable regions in Europe. Widely referred to as NATO's Achilles heel, this vital land bridge separates Russia's heavily militarized Kaliningrad exclave from Belarus, which is practically Russia-light at this point. Since the Suwalki Gap is the only land connection between NATO's Baltic member states and the rest of Europe, control over this corridor would enable Russia to cut off Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia from NATO reinforcements over land. The strategic path to Russia's goal is brutal and simple: overwhelm the Baltic states, cut off its only land route to the rest of NATO, and force a government overthrow before the rest of the alliance could get its militaries mobilized. Of course, recent years have shifted this equation slightly in NATO's favor, as both Sweden and Finland joined in the 2020s. The two newest members will be able to provide vital aerial and naval support as a first response. Additionally, Finland giving the US and the rest of NATO leeway to use 15 military installations in the country allows the alliance to permanently keep forces at the ready while not being directly in the Baltics, where they will be at the highest risk, or in Poland, where they will be directly opposing forces in Kaliningrad and Belarus. But what fully turned the tenuous relationship between Russia and NATO to outward hostility was the start of the war in Ukraine, which practically removed any notion that Russia was ambivalent or friendly toward its former Soviet neighbors. For the Baltic states, the invasion in 2022 was essentially a preview of what might be coming next. However, the war in Ukraine also revealed something that fundamentally changed the strategic calculus. Russia's military wasn't the unstoppable force that NATO planners had feared. The same army that was supposed to capture Baltic capitals in 36 hours struggled to take Ukrainian cities for months, and yet this realization came with yet another terrifying possibility. Putin was willing to conduct a brutal, almost genocidal war against Ukraine, a country that it needed for both its natural and demographic resources. The Baltics aren't at all similar in culture to Russia, and don't have the same resources or tactical benefits. Given that Russia is prepared to mow down Ukrainians to reach Kyiv despite historical ties, it would likely be much more willing to do so in the Baltics. The Baltic states believe that they cannot give up ground, which means recognizing that they need to be prepared to contest a Russian invasion from the first moments following the violation of Baltic borders. This is coupled with NATO's intelligence assessments becoming increasingly alarming. As the war rages on, German military strategists believe that Russia would come directly at NATO by 2030. Which leads us to the scale of the problem. How do three relatively small nations create viable defensive plans when their only real link to the outside world is the same country they're trying to defend against? The answer is the planned Baltic Defense Line, which was publicly announced on January 19, 2024, at a meeting between the Ministers of Defense of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania in Riga. The scope of the project is staggering by any measure. Based on the initial agreement, the estimated €60 million, $65 million, anti-mobility installation project will see bunkers rise throughout 2025 and beyond. But Estonia's portion alone reveals the true ambition of this undertaking. The new bunkers, similar to underground cellars already commonly found in Estonia, are expected to be 35 square meters, 377 square feet, hardened to withstand artillery strikes, and house up to 10 soldiers. This isn't some Maginot Line fantasy about stopping tanks with concrete. Estonian military planners understand exactly what they're building and why. The Estonian government has suggested that the project envisions the defensive line not as a final stand. Instead, it's meant to deter Russia from conducting a full-on assault across the Russia-Baltic states border and focus on predetermined locations that would be less defended, but which would get increased NATO support in turn. The strategy is also more sophisticated than permanent defensive fortifications. Estonia and its neighbors are looking at how much of the defensive line could be built with 1 month's warning and only trying to buy and build the parts that need to be deployed first. The rest of the construction would only happen once war becomes imminent. Additionally, all countries are reportedly sourcing and stockpiling mines to use them alongside defensive fortifications. The mines won't be laid down just yet, but that's about to change. In March 2025, the Baltic states and Poland announced their withdrawal from the Ottawa Treaty, citing rising Russian aggression and the need for mines as a vital component of modern defensive warfare, especially in the narrow, contested terrain of the Baltic region. Since early 2024, when the initial plans for the line were announced, the Baltics had roughly a year and a half, at the time of this video, to exercise the plan in reality. For Estonia, construction began in June 2025. This is woefully behind Latvia, where the first construction efforts were reported as early as May 2024. The first signs of the defense line are anti-tank ditches being dug in villages that are closest to the Estonia-Russia border, with the first such ditch reported in Vinski. Each trench is approximately 13 feet wide, 6.5 feet deep, and stretches for 2.5 miles. The ditches are designed to serve as guides for Russia's mechanized infantry and main battle tank. They would either slow down the advance or force senior Russian officers to adapt and change the plan of attack, which is not Russia's forte by the looks of its track record in Ukraine. But the ditches are just the beginning. By the end of the year, Estonia plans to build 28 bunkers and 10 ammunition storage facilities. The current value of the project is €4.4 million or $5 million, out of the €20 million or $23 million the country needs to invest. Estonia will create a military base in the border city of Narva, where up to 250 Estonian and NATO troops will be stationed. Estonia has also completed the test phase of 3 bunker prototypes, attacking and then assessing the weak points of each design with howitzers commonly used in the war in Ukraine. The most successful bunker will be used to retrofit existing builds. More importantly, NATO now has much more information about the specifics and efficiency of Russia's military equipment, thanks to Ukraine sending over that data in exchange for developing more prototypes. While the other Baltic states are doing their own thing and sharing the results, Estonia is somewhat unique in its recognition of Russia's aggression and doubling down on defense investment. When most countries were debating whether they could afford to meet NATO's previous 2% GDP defense spending target, Estonia had approved a 4-year defense investment plan, complete with additional funding of €2.8 billion or $3.2 billion. This allows Tallinn to allocate 5.4% of GDP on average toward military budgeting for the rest of the decade. The spending isn't just about traditional military hardware, but in the same capabilities that proved decisive in Ukraine. This could not only mean improvements to existing tank and infantry support vehicle designs, but also investment in drone warfare, which we've discussed plenty of times on this channel as redefining the nature of war. Of course, this all hinges on the defensive strategy actually working, and while there are a few problems and design issues that it might need to overcome, the actual strategy might just allow the Baltics to pull its grand plans off. The main argument is that the Baltic Defense Line might not be enough to create an effective defense against Russian forces. The 3 countries combined don't have a large enough military force or land between their border and their capitals to mount decisive stands. However, the bunker line is not actually meant to stop a Russian attack but shape it, as former Estonian Defense Forces Commander General Martin Herem explained. The actual strategy is more nuanced and potentially more effective. The Ukrainian conflict has shown that even small delays and complications can have massive effects on military operations. Russia's initial assumption that it could capture Kyiv in days was shattered by Ukrainian resistance that forced Russian forces into costly urban warfare and extended supply lines. This led to logistics breakdowns that allowed Ukraine to retake most of the territory it lost in the first few weeks of the invasion. The Baltic Defense Line is designed to create similar complications, but on a much more systematic level. By forcing Russian forces to either bypass heavily fortified positions, thus extending their supply lines and exposing their flanks, or assault prepared defensive positions, causing casualties and delays, the line changes the fundamentals of the invasion and forces Russia to be the one to adapt rather than the Baltics adapting to Russian advances. But there's an even deeper strategic logic at work. The vulnerability of the Baltic states is balanced by the vulnerability of the Kaliningrad Oblast, an isolated exclave of Russian territory. While the region has significant military deployment and is home to a part of Russia's Baltic fleet, its isolation from the mainland means that NATO could easily mount a counteroffensive from Germany and Poland, 2 countries that have already pledged increased national defense spending and troop sizes. This creates mutual vulnerability, a situation where both sides have something to lose, potentially stabilizing the situation through deterrence rather than escalation. Then there's the aforementioned accession of Finland to NATO. This doubled the border between Russia and NATO while also adding yet another country with a varied history with Russia and which has the motive and means to be a thorn in Russia's plans to invade into the mix. And the Baltic Defense Line is more than a regional defensive project. It's becoming yet another testing ground for 21st century warfare and a model that other nations could follow in their regional conflicts. Estonia's approach is particularly significant because it demonstrates how smaller nations can achieve effective deterrence without trying to match larger neighbors tank for tank or missile for missile. The Baltic Defense Line, combined with Estonia's broader military modernization, represents a porcupine strategy, making the cost of aggression higher than any potential benefit. To support this effort, Estonia is also buying up conventional equipment. This includes HIMARS batteries, which have proven extremely useful in creating opportunities to endanger Russia's offensive positions, as well as IRIS-T medium-range air defense systems, which would deny Russia the ability to pilot its aircraft close to the border. This is also much more important in the Baltic than in Ukraine, as St. Petersburg, the second largest city in Russia, is 190 miles away from Finland and 84 miles from Narva. This would force Russia to simultaneously attack and defend itself against NATO, which could drain its resources and morale much quicker than in Ukraine. And the Baltic Defense Line isn't just a military project, it's reshaping Estonian society, as the country is expecting to have 4,000 more combat-ready troops by the end of the decade. This is a staggering number when the country's total population is 1.3 million and the current active troop size is only 7,700. Estonia's Defense Forces website states this will lead to half the men born in a given year serving in the military, being one of the few NATO members that maintains mandatory military service. The social transformation goes beyond military training. Children are now receiving basic military education in high schools, and families are rehearsing evacuation scenarios. Estonia is essentially preparing its entire population for the possibility of conflict. But this preparation reveals internal challenges. Estonia has a significant ethnic Russian population thanks to its Soviet history, which is concentrated especially in the same regions where much of the Baltic Defense Line is being built. The Estonian plan features construction in Ida-Viru County in northeast Estonia, where ethnic Russians outnumber ethnic Estonians at a rate of 3.5 to 1. Public opinion surveys reveal the complications this creates. According to a 2024 survey commissioned by the Ministry of Defense, 67% of ethnic Estonians would give up their land to defense forces if Estonia were attacked, as opposed to only 38% of non-ethnic Estonians. Some people are not directly opposed to the construction efforts per se, but are worried that they would become a self-fulfilling prophecy in that Russia would attempt to attack before the defensive line is complete. The answer to this is to ensure that the rest of NATO can muster its forces and economies to fully support both Ukraine and the Baltics and deter further Russian aggression. The success or failure of the Baltic Defense Line will likely influence defense planning across the globe. If the project proves effective at deterring aggression, expect to see similar approaches in other vulnerable regions. If it fails to deter or proves ineffective in actual conflict, the lessons will reshape military thinking for decades. Thank you for watching. If you want to see how Finland is preparing for Russia's aggression, check out our other video. And if you want to stay updated on how the war in Ukraine and European security developments are reshaping global geopolitics, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more in-depth analyses and daily news.